Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. Good to see you, Leonard.
Nice to see you, Patrick.
So
What
you're in Chicago today,
I
I
am.
gather?
I'm in Chicago, my hometown, ready to go for our very first show, right?
That's right. So yeah, I'm
First interview. Yeah.
coming to you from my farm in New Jersey. I've got a little studio here. Used to be a chicken coop at one time. Now it's my office and studio, and super excited to start to kick this thing off. Our first guest is our old friend and award-winning independent journalist, Aaron Maté. And when we did this interview with Aaron, it was early getting this thing going, and we didn't even know what we were going to call it. It's now Unfettered Speech Podcast, but we had all kinds of ideas, which all of it had been taken. So all the good ideas have been taken, and so we left with what we had. But just kidding. We're excited about Unfettered Speech. Excited to talk to Aaron. Let's. We talked a little bit before about independent journalism, but and the connection with integrity media. But maybe you can talk a little bit about your interest in journalism. You're a constitutional lawyer. I'm a corporate lawyer and businessman. None of us are. You might be more of a journalist than I am, but how? Maybe you can explain a little bit about how you developed an interest in
Yeah.
journalism and
Well, I'm not,
specifically this kind of journalism.
yeah. Well, I'm not a journalist. I have been a columnist before, but Pat and we met each other in college, Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. Um, I can't even remember what you were. You were political science or history?
History, Asian history
History.
is where I ended up.
Okay. Yeah, I remember you spent some time in Japan.
Yep.
Um, I was a science person all through college, physics and engineering. And then when I graduated college, I came to realize that the only jobs, this was back, I hate to date myself, but this was back in the 1980s. And it's similar to the situation today. A lot of the jobs were in the defense industry. And one of the things I knew is I did not want to participate in that industry. I grew up around war profiteers. I've been involved with, I have a lot of associates in there, and it's something I did not want to be involved in. And so I ended up going to law school and becoming a criminal defense lawyer. With respect to journalism, I think my eyes really got opened in the early aughts, the early 2000s, in the run up to the Iraq War. And I remember just hearing the explanation for why we need to go to war against Iraq kept changing. It was, oh, because Saddam is a horrible dictator. He murdered his own people. Then it was, well, he's getting nuclear weapons and we've got this document that proves it. And then there's these mobile labs and he could give this to terrorists that could come to the United States. And, you know,
I'm laughing because it all seems so silly. There were aluminum tubes, Leonard.
right.
Aluminum tubes, I
Aluminum
tell you.
tube. And
So yeah, and again, it seems so silly, but I
but the
believed it at that
mainstream
time.
the mainstream media uh, bought it all, and that was what was so shocking to me. That every leak from the government was just printed in the front page in the New York Times as if it was fact. They did no investigation, and that was shocking to me. Horrible journalism, and then I think with the war in Ukraine, it's taken to a level. The mainstream media has gone to a level that's even more absurd, where now they're just printing pure propaganda for war. At least with the Iraq War, you got the feeling that they were just being dumb. They were just bad journalists. They just believed. But now they're actually doing propaganda where they'll say this is an unprovoked invasion, even though on the pages of the New York Times in 2014 they reported on the coup and they reported on the CIA involvement and and NATO expansion and all these things. So it's so I think this comes back to Aaron Mate is one of the people that I've trusted for
Yeah.
accurate information when it comes to foreign policy, whether it's Syria, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, has been Aaron Mate.
Oh, he's great. And one of the things you're right about that, and again, fell for the WMDs thing when I was told it. But as a student of history, you can go back and you can see the pattern. You see it every time, right? And especially since wars became sort of entwined with public relations, which was probably started in the Spanish-American War and the Hearst papers that pushed it so hard. But there has to be a narrative that includes a good side and a bad side, and the bad side does things like kills babies. There's sexual violence or rape is used as a justification, but one side is set up as being this a dictator. One side's a democracy, the other side's a dictator. Even though, let's face it, every arrangement that societies have to govern themselves has some democratic elements. It has other elements. There's no such thing as an absolute dictator. People are negotiating their societies, and someone becomes a leader. But in the narrative of war, someone's the bad guy who's the dictator. And so you see it over and over again. And you saw it in the Ukrainian war. You saw it in the Syrian conflict. You saw it in Iraq, of course, and the Kuwaiti conflict,
Vietnam.
Yeah. In Serbia. Someone's killing babies, someone's raping people, someone's, that there's these things that make it that we've got to, we don't want to hurt anyone, but in order to stop these bad people, we've got to do some bad things to preserve democracy and goodness and light. And, and it all turns out horribly wrong.
And
So Aaron's
Pat,
been
don't you get
go
Pat,
ahead.
don't you get the feeling? Don't you get the feeling that a lot of these justifications, whether it's raping, whether it's rape rooms or throwing babies out of incubators, don't you get the feeling that these are all focus tested in some sort of
Oh yeah,
room,
I think they
by
come,
the
they're
media? Okay, I
focus grouped,
think
and I
this
think
is
they
going to
come out of a
sell.
playbook. It's a playbook at this point.
Yeah,
Like if you and I were going to start a war somewhere, we would hire a PR firm, and they would say, well, look, let's play up a baby angle. Let's play up they're going to play these angles because they work, right? They're tested and true. But anyway, people are getting a little bit wise, and so it's interesting how independent media has flourished with the internet, and you have hundreds and thousands of people who aren't buying it anymore. And by the way, you've mentioned this before, the legacy media is trusted by, it has a lower rating than Congress. It's trusted by less than 25, less than I think 20% of all people now trust what they hear in legacy corporate media. And you see this huge flourishing of independent media, which is what integrity media supports. So it all kind of comes together. And to have Aaron as our first guest, I mean, he was a natural, being a person who's always been out there. And one of the things that we talked to him about is how he got there. It's a hard road that he's chosen to take. I mean, the easy road, I think he mentioned it, would be, you know, get into an organization and do what they want, right? And say what they want. And, your life will become pretty cushy. But he didn't do that. He's a brave man, and someone who believes in the truth as he sees it.
right. And I think the other interesting thing about Aaron is, and I think this will be true of almost all of our guests, is they're all really talented journalists who
Yes.
could easily make their way in corporate media, probably and probably make a lot more money.
Yep.
And that's part of the reason why we're here at Integrity Media, to try to help these people so that they don't feel the urge or the need to sell out, to try to support them.
Yeah. So we're going to see, Aaron's a great kickoff. We're going to see a lot of people that are kind of in his mold, and other people who might come from a different place. But I love people who are intelligent and who are cutting their own path. I think those are the most interesting and exciting people to talk to. So I'm super excited to talk to Aaron, and our lineup. I'll just tease it a little bit. That we're going to have other people of similar quality that are going to be kind of hopefully it'll be fun conversations.
Including Aaron's partner, current partner, Max Blumenthal.
Yes, and Ray McGovern, and
Judge
and others.
Napolitano.
Judge Napolitano, and
Ralph
yeah,
Nader. Yeah.
lots of interesting people. So we're looking forward to this. Craig Murray, I hope will come on.
Yeah.
Alexander McCorris. So it'll be a good guest group for sure.
John Cleese, I'm hoping.
Nice. Nice. Well,
Somebody that has spent a career
yeah, John
challenging.
Cleese doesn't know he's coming on yet, but he is.
He is.
Yeah.
We're honored to have as our first guest. Couldn't be a better first guest that we have. independent journalist from Vancouver, Canada, a reporter with the Gray Zone, which is an independent news site founded by Max Blumenthal, host of the show Pushback, co-host of Useful Idiots with Katie Halper. He writes at Substack, The Nation, and many other publications, and he's a weekly guest on Judging Freedom with Judge Napolitano. So let's welcome Aaron Maté.
Welcome, Aaron.
Len and Pat, great to be here with you. Thank you for having me as your first guest.
A good choice, I think.
Well, you'll see. We'll find out.
We'll see. One of the things that I admire most about your journalism is that you debunk with hard facts lies and propaganda that take us to war. As former U.S. Marine Smedley Butler said famously, war is a racket. And you are one of the premier debunkers of that racket, which is one of the reasons why we wanted you as our first guest. Some of the wars that you have debunked, some of the justifications for, of course, the dirty war in Syria, the proxy war in Ukraine, and I don't even know if we call it a war, but the destruction of Gaza. And if it's okay, I'd like to begin with some of your reporting on Israel-Palestine and particularly October 7th. It's kind of hard to look away right now from what's going on in Gaza. So I'd like to ask you to maybe give us a little bit of an update. What's the current situation there? We're reading about mass starvation. And I'd also like you to talk about your reporting on October 7th. All of us remember the mainstream press stories that came out right after October 7th about mass rapes, beheaded babies in ovens. This is something that you and Max, I think with a lot of courage, did some investigation into, had some very interesting reporting. And I'd love to hear you talk about that. What made you guys suspect about some of the narratives that were coming out after October 7th? And what was the reaction to the reporting that you did?
On the first question, what's happening now, it's just a starvation siege. Israel, as we're recording this, has blocked everything from going into Gaza for 2 months. And they're doing this with the full support of the Trump administration. Trump recently made some comments about how we're going to take care of it. People in Gaza are suffering, but that's the last we heard of it. Trump's done absolutely nothing to pressure Israel. And of course, we know from the Biden administration that when the U.S. does use its leverage, Israel does behave and it complies. When the Biden administration did put pressure on Israel to allow an aid, they allowed in more aid. And that speaks to the overwhelming leverage that the U.S. has over Israel. There was just an article that came out of Israel speaking to a number of former Biden administration officials as well as Israeli officials about the Biden administration's conduct. And one former Israeli ambassador said that God blessed Israel to have Biden in power because they never pressured us once for a ceasefire. And that's exactly what Trump has continued to do. And this comes after Netanyahu blew up the ceasefire deal that Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, helped negotiate. There was multiple phases to that deal. Phase 2 was up next, and it was supposed to get to basically a state where there was a permanent end to all Israeli military activity in Gaza and a withdrawal. And Netanyahu didn't want to do that for two main reasons. One, he wants to continue destroying Gaza to force as many Palestinians as possible to leave. That's his open goal. And that's been a goal of Israeli leaders for a very long time. And also, he wants to prolong his political career. And he knows that once all this is over, once the fighting is over, once the hostages are returned home, he'll have to answer for all of his corruption scandals, as well as the negligence around October 7th, which was a massive intelligence failure and security failure by Israel. And Trump has given him a complete pass.
We were told by AOC that they were working tirelessly, I believe the quote was, to end the war in Gaza. It sounds like there's now some admissions that was not correct.
Yeah, this is all Biden administration officials in the article I was talking about saying, yeah, we never did anything. And Israeli officials saying, yeah, we never got any pressure. Now, there was sometimes some pressure to let in more aid, which Trump now is not even doing, despite him claiming recently that he was going to put pressure or he was going to take care of it, which basically means nothing. But yeah, AOC's comment What can you say about that? Using a genocide, lying about genocide, mass murder, whatever you want to call it, lying about Kamala Harris and Biden supposedly tirelessly working for a ceasefire when they were doing the exact opposite. And she hasn't apologized for that. And if I were her, I would find a way to apologize, because one of the reasons why Kamala Harris lost, it's not the only reason, but a lot of Democrats just couldn't turn out to vote for her because she wouldn't distance herself from Joe Biden's policy of giving carte blanche to Israel. If I were advising her back when she made that comment, I would have said, speak aspirationally. Say Kamala Harris will work tirelessly for a ceasefire. Now, that would have been a lie, but it wouldn't have been an easily provable lie because it's aspirational, right? Like, and that's after she takes office. Instead, she actively lied about what Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were doing at the time, which is the exact opposite of what she said. And it's just so shameful. And she was even called out by some members of the squad. Her colleagues like Ilhan Omar said that was never true, and recently said the same thing. So I hope politically she'll see the benefit in apologizing if she wants to, speak to the Democratic base that she will need if she has aspirations for even higher office.
Well, that's a little bit of a standard trope for politicians, and especially Democratic politicians, the fighting for trope. We're fighting for Social Security. We're fighting for, whatever it is. And they're never achieving anything. They're just saying, they don't even promise anything. They just say, we're going to fight for it, whatever that means. And it doesn't mean anything. So working tirelessly is right in the same vein of, no, we're not really doing anything. We're just telling you that it's really hard. And, we're making effort, as if effort alone without result is meaningful in any way to anybody. But Can we turn to your reporting and how, because you were one of the first, you in the Gray Zone were one of the first to debunk some of those stories coming out of October 7th. What motivated you to do that? How did you come up with the reporting that you did, and what was the reaction to it?
First of all, I really followed the lead of Max Blumenthal on this, and also Ali Abunimah of the Electronic Intifada. And they were at the forefront of just pointing out from the start that while there were atrocities committed by Palestinian militants on October 7th, I mean, no one denies that. There are, killings of civilians on video, which is a war crime. That's an atrocity. There's no controversy about that. But for some reason, Israel and its apologists weren't content to just let what was true speak for itself. They manufactured claims that were just completely lurid and shocking, but totally baseless. For example, 40 beheaded babies, which was repeated on corporate TV, burned babies as well. There was an incident on CNN where a CNN anchor, Sarah Snyder, reported one of these false claims about slain babies as fact and said that it's confirmed by the Israeli government, as if the Israeli government telling you something means it's confirmed. No, in journalism, you confirm something by independently verifying it yourself. And that was a very revealing moment when a CNN anchor just decided that Israel saying something was sufficient for confirmation. Then there was also the fact that there was witness testimony from the start that Israeli forces were firing at some of the vehicles that were taking captives back to Gaza and even into some of the homes. And this was reported in the Israeli press, but here in the US media, that was completely omitted from all reporting. You just could not acknowledge that. And so people like Max Blumenthal and Ali Abunimah were among the very few to just relay what the Israeli press was reporting, but that we weren't getting here. And what fueled the skepticism was just, I've been through enough conflicts now where I can just see some certain patterns, like where you have what's available to you evidence-wise, and you can see in the footage, and that we all can, reasonably say with confidence occurred. And then you have all these lurid claims that go far beyond that. And this is, something that we saw with the Iraq War, with Iraq WMDs. Like, we know Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. We know he tortured people. We know he massacred a lot of people. But the claims about Iraq WMDs working with Al-Qaeda, we never saw any evidence for that. And a lesson that every journalist should have taken from that is don't parrot claims, and certainly don't parrot claims without evidence. Parrot claims if you can confirm them yourself, especially if they're of the consequence of going to war. And that's what Israel was doing here.
Before you move on from that point, would you agree that sort of
because, in my lifetime, pretty much every war from Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin, began with lies. But it seems like these sort of lurid allegations involving rape and babies is something that has been developed. Maybe it's particularly effective, but we've seen it again and again in recent wars. I mean, going back to the first Gulf War, it was Saddam's men taking babies out of incubators that turned out to be a complete hoax. Then there was, the Libya war and the claims about mass rape with soldiers fueled with Viagra that turned out to be a hoax. And then, of course, I remember from the run up to the Iraq War, #2, claims about rape rooms, which I don't know if it was true or if there was any evidence of that, but it just struck me as particularly suspect at the time. And then, of course, as you say, it's accompanied by allegations about weapons of mass destruction, which we know were tested with focus groups to see, because if you remember the justification for that war kept shifting it was nuclear weapons, and then it was Saddam's a bad guy and he tortures people and kills his own people with chemical weapons. So anyway, so I'm just wondering whether those particular things have those sort of lurid details raise red flags, or should raise red flags for journalists that write about war.
They absolutely should, especially if they're being lodged to help justify launching violence against, in the case of Gaza, vulnerable people. I mean, this was not a war against Hamas. This was a war against a defenseless population. There's no air defense. There's no artillery. There's no shelters in Gaza. And that's what Israel was preparing. And they're trapped and they can't go anywhere. And Israeli officials were openly saying, we're going to deny all food, fuel, water to Gaza. These are human animals. It was obvious what they were preparing for. And when that's accompanied by these lurid, horrific allegations, absolutely alarm bells should have gone off in way more journalists, but they didn't. And people were this is what happens in these horrific moments, in these times of crisis. People are just sort of intimidated into silence. And that's the point of lodging allegations like this. It's very uncomfortable, especially to challenge an allegation such as rape, sexual violence, especially if you're a straight male. It's just, it's sensitive to raise questions about that. And I remember I was uncomfortable doing that. But at the same time, you have to be objective and looking at this journalistically. And there was nothing to support all of these lurid claims. And if you think about it from the perspective of the Israeli victims of October 7th, to launch evidence-free claims was also insulting to them, because what the people pushing the mass rape allegation of October 7th were doing was exploiting Israeli women and slaying Israeli women and making some families fear that their loved one had been violated in that way. And that also was very cynical and horrific. And so in that case, it's very clear what happened. There was some mention of sexual violence right after October 7th, but it wasn't very much. But as Israel built up its campaign against Gaza in those early months, as international pressure was going, as the Biden administration was feeling a lot of pressure to stop Israel, because now we're talking about, November, December, that's when you saw these stories of mass rape on October 7th really being pushed. So in late December, more than 2 months after October 7th, that's when the New York Times comes out with this article called Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th. And this is the story that really pushed that narrative of mass rape on October 7th into the mainstream. And people, this is the New York Times, this is a serious newspaper. And they spoke about interviewing dozens of people, doing all this detailed reporting. So how could anybody possibly challenge this? Well, you look at the article and there's just absolutely nothing to go with. They don't identify a single Israeli person who's confirmed to have been the victim of sexual violence. And in fact, the problem they had was that the woman they chose to make their symbol, what they called the symbol of sexual violence on October 7th, her family immediately called out the New York Times and said that they were manipulating the story, the evidence, and also have manipulated them, because when the Times spoke to them, they didn't tell them that they were going to make their daughter, their sister, whose name was Gal Abdush, the symbol of sexual violence. And they pointed out that, in fact, they had spoken to her right before she was killed. And there's no way in the time between when they spoke to her and when she was killed, which was a matter of a minute or two, it was a very short amount of time, that she could have been raped or the victim of sexual violence. So that was their first problem, is that the person they chose as like their symbol of sexual violence, the family called them out. And then you had them speaking to a bunch of people who called themselves witnesses, and their stories made absolutely no sense, and there was no forensic evidence to support it. And that was the problem with this claim too. Israeli authorities, if you read the Israeli press, admitted they had no forensic evidence, they had no physical evidence, there was no audio or video footage. There was only claims by anonymous witnesses, some of whom had already spoken of claims that had already fallen apart, such as burned and beheaded babies from a group called Zaka, which is a rescue organization inside Israel and very controversial. So you put all this together and there's nothing there. And it was clear to us what was going on. It was part of a propaganda campaign to manufacture consent for the ongoing atrocity, the one happening before our eyes, which was, killing tens of thousands of people inside Gaza, destroying their infrastructure. And so that's what compelled us to, as uncomfortable as it admittedly it was, to call this out and to point out the flaws in this story.
There's this film going around that I've heard from friends of mine in DC that are, in high places in DC, and that's shown to high officials, Congress people. I know Witkoff spoke about it in one of his interviews, that he was shown this film. And it's basically a film that shows atrocities and appears to get people to get behind unquestionably the mass slaughter in Gaza. What do you know about that film? Have you seen it? Do you know what's in that film? What are people being shown?
Israel put together a compilation of footage that was taken from Palestinian militants and their cameras of them killing civilians on October 7th. And as far as I know, that's accurate footage. And it's horrific. I mean, killing civilians is a war crime. But what it doesn't show is any evidence of all the most lurid claims about October 7th, including burned and beheaded babies and mass rapes. I know for a fact that there's no evidence of any of that in that tape. And some people will cite that film that was shown to journalists and shown at the White House as evidence of these aforementioned, lurid, allegations, even though it's not actually in there. But the aim was obvious. Israel wanted to help build support for its effort to ethnically cleanse Gaza and to destroy it and to kill tens of thousands of people. And so that's what they showed people. But again, if you watch a film of atrocities against civilians, why should your takeaway be, let's go commit more atrocities against way more civilians? Because the death toll from October 7th is, about 1,200 or so, 12 or 1,300. A few hundred of those are military security. But you have hundreds of civilians killed by Palestinian militants on October 7th. That's confirmed. That happened. Now we don't know how many of them were killed by Israel, because Israel did enact the Hannibal Directive, which says that we'd rather kill our own people than let them be taken captive by Palestinians, because we don't want to negotiate with Palestinians. We don't want to have to release their prisoners, which was part of Hamas's aim on October 7th. So we do know that Israel killed some of its own people on October 7th. We don't know how many. Some of my colleagues believe it was the majority of civilian deaths. I have no idea. All I know is when you have Israeli tanks and helicopters firing on the vehicles that are fleeing back to Gaza and on some of the homes, because at least one home was targeted by an Israeli tank, that will kill people. But why should the takeaway be from watching a video of atrocities that Israel should go and kill more people and commit way more, tens of thousands of more atrocities? That's the part that's incongruent here. No matter how many horrific things happened on October 7th by Palestinian militants, why should that lead one to conclude that Israel should commit infinitely more atrocities, especially when there are other solutions, including ending one of the longest running military occupations in the world?
Well, I think that's been true historically, as Leonard pointed out, even prior to our lifetimes. It's really when PR started in about World War I, and the nation state was an active thing. People in nation states don't want to go to war unless there's something that's very it's a territorial incursion, something important that they're willing to fight and die over. And so in World War I, they hit on this rape idea, and the Germans were accused of raping people in Belgium. And ever since, there's needed to be something like that to move the war. And it PR and justifications go hand in hand. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Aaron, because I think it's been something that's been a constant with you, even maybe back to your college days, I think. There's an article in a blog called X-Urb, and it talks about censorship. And one of the things that it says is the most powerful form of censorship is private censorship, and that public censors or government censors absolutely rely on incentives, social incentives to amplify what they're doing. They would no otherwise they wouldn't have the power to do it. Even in the days of Galileo, for instance, prosecuting Galileo was to send a message to other scientists. It wasn't necessarily prosecute, because it was sort of the Barbra Streisand effect, where Galileo became much more famous, but other people sort of, got the message to not publish things that were threatening to the church. You've felt that, I think, your whole career, where you publish something and you must get a tremendous amount of blowback from people who have an interest in pushing whatever the PR-driven narrative is. How do you deal with that, and how do you think about that?
Well, I think I have tremendous privilege. First of all, just living in North America. I grew up in Canada, but I've lived in the U.S. now for 20 years. I think I have tremendous privilege, and with privilege comes opportunity. And I feel grateful for that. And so I think, given how lucky I am to live in a relatively free society, why wouldn't I want to use that freedom to speak what I perceive to be the truth? My father grew up, he was born in Hungary, and then Nazi Germany occupied Hungary, where he was born. So that was the first year or so of his life. And then he grew up under Stalin. And so I just know, just hearing his recollections of life under Stalin, just what a gift it is to be in a society that has relative freedom. I'm not saying there's not problems with where we live, and I've tried to document them, but just having at least the freedom to express yourself is a huge gift. And I just feel not only a responsibility, but also I appreciate the opportunity, and I want to use it to the most that I can. And when we are constantly propagandized and lied to by our leaders and by our media class, I just think that those of us who are aware of what's going on and who have the time and the resources to try to shine a light on what's happening, I feel like we have a duty to do that. So that's what I'm just trying to do my part. And that is someone who has relative privilege, relative opportunity, and an interest in all these stories that are going on, and all these, huge decisions and acts of government, including war, that impact our world.
Aaron, you mentioned that you felt some discomfort coming forward with debunking allegations on October 7th. You grew up Jewish, as did I. You in Vancouver, me in Chicago. Just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your Jewish education and how that has influenced, if it did at all, your worldview. And then, I'd like to ask you a little bit about Zionism as well. Just if you could talk a little bit about your background religiously.
My background in a Jewish context is, I think it's pretty unique because, so first of all, there's the shadow of the Nazi Holocaust hanging over everything. My father, Gabor, was, as I said, an infant born into Hungary right before the Nazis occupied it, and barely survived infancy under Nazi occupation. His mother, my grandmother Judy, smuggled him basically to relatives out of Budapest, gave Gabor, my father, over to a stranger in the street and said, please take him to these relatives, which thankfully the stranger did. And so the legacy of the Nazi Holocaust, was hanging over my family, throughout my life. But also, in my case, my dad is, he became an anti-Zionist at a relatively young age. He was a Zionist as a child, and it particularly coming from that background of surviving the Nazi genocide, it makes perfect sense why, Jews from that era would embrace Israel, this idea of a national home for Jews, a place where they can be safe and not face extermination. It had obvious appeal. And my father was among countless Jews who was drawn to that. But then, he's also a very critical thinker. And when he began reading in his early 20s about what the contrary point of view was, like what the Arab point of view was about Israel, he realized what had happened, that this was a state that was founded on ethnic cleansing and at somebody else's expense. And he didn't want to be a part of that. So my whole life, I was raised by a father who was anti-Zionist, but still, because of just the way our family dynamic had worked, my uncles met their spouses at a Jewish Zionist summer camp, and that was just a big thing for our family. So I still went to a Zionist summer camp where we also were taught left-wing values, like socialist values. So it was both Zionist, but also socialist, where they're teaching you about social justice and critical thinking and standing up for the oppressed, while still indoctrinating you in Zionism. So it's a little discordant. But this was at a time when the idea of there were strains of Zionism that were socialist and left-leaning. And I mean, not everybody went to Israel to, ethnically cleanse Palestinians. There were people who went there with good intentions, but that's just what the state became. So I was raised in that environment. So going to a Zionist summer camp, but still being, raised by a father who taught me to disregard basically what I was being told about Israel. And, I did the Sunday school thing. I had a bar mitzvah, and that was a meaningful experience. And, from all that, I can see how it works. I mean, you go to these summer camps, you go to Sunday school, you have these meaningful experiences. Like my bar mitzvah was meaningful to me, very meaningful. And because of just the way because of the role Israel plays in all of this, you end up subconsciously associating all these good memories, all these formative years, all these friends you make. And I've made amazing friends that whole experience with Israel. And so if somebody challenges Israel, then they're challenging you and your whole identity. And that's very, very hard to break down. For me, it was never really a problem because I had the instruction of my father, to sort of balance out all the indoctrination I was getting. But I think for many North American Jews who come up in a similar culture, it's difficult. And that's why it's taken some people a very long time. And some people still have not woken up to the reality of what Israel is. And they're still living in this myth of what they were told Israel once was. But the problem was, although there are strains of Zionism that I identify with, there was a famous Zionist 100 years ago named Ahad Hayam, who never wanted to have a state that privileged the rights of Jews over anybody else. He wanted to have a state that celebrated, and protected Jewish culture, but never one that said Jews have more rights than anybody else, and certainly don't have more rights than the indigenous people of this land whose homes we are stealing, which is the Palestinians. So he called himself a Zionist because he believed in the idea of some sort of Jewish national home. But for him, that didn't mean it had to be in Palestine, where people already lived and would have to be expelled from. But somebody who thought differently was someone like Zev Jabotinsky, who was a hardline Zionist, who turns out, I've recently learned, was a good friend of my great-grandfather's and may have actually helped save my father's life. It's a long story, but that's just one historical tie I have to that movement. But Jabotinsky said that Zionism is a colonizing adventure, that there are people already living there, and they're not going to take us in voluntarily. If we want to have our land there, we're going to have to expel them by force. And that's what Israel became.
It's interesting, that you had this sort of anti-Zionism influence from your father, because I think a lot of North American Jews don't really have that. I mean, we're sort of taught that, that protecting the state of Israel is sort of a fundamental duty of Jews in the United States. And I wonder, and then we'll move on, but I just wonder if you think that is changing. I know for me, October 7th and sort of the aftermath of that has caused me, for the first time in my life, and I'm a lot older than you, to start questioning some of the things that I believed. I mean, I was always a believer in the two-state solution. I've been to the West Bank. I've seen the checkpoint. But I never really looked back at 1948 and the Nakba. And this has sort of forced me to do that. I'm just wondering whether you think that's something that a lot of Jews are starting to question, and what that means for the future.
Absolutely. I think a lot more Jewish people are starting to question Israel and what they were taught about it in the aftermath of October 7th. How can you not, just with the images we see? And we don't even see everything. We don't even know how horrible it is. So yes, absolutely. And certainly I see in the younger generations, students in college today, there's a huge awakening that has never been present before, which I think is very encouraging. And yeah, in the shadow of the Holocaust, I'm sympathetic. I understand, given the trauma of the Holocaust, how hard it is for people to challenge what they were taught about Israel, given the image they were basically indoctrinated with about Israel being a refuge for the Jewish people after the trauma of the Holocaust. So I understand that's a very hard thing to challenge. But right now, I mean, how can you not challenge that anymore, given what is happening? And, one thing that I find interesting about the role of Israel in North American Jewish life, it really changed after 1967. And I'm drawing this from the work of Norman Finkelstein. What he says is that before 1967, Israel did not play such a major role in North American Jewish life, at least nowhere near to the degree that it's played since then. But after 1967, that's when Israel sort of became officially a proxy of the U.S. Before 1967, there were relations, but the relationship wasn't nearly as close as it has become since. And once Israel became a proxy of the U.S. in 67 by basically smashing Arab nationalism, and that's what Israel did in the Six-Day War, basically by taking the Syrian Golan Heights and the Sinai from Egypt, it dealt a very big blow to Arab nationalism in the region and a boost to the U.S. effort to basically control Middle East oil through friendly Gulf monarchies. So Israel showed it could be a trusted client. And also at a time when the U.S. was mired in Vietnam, there was something encouraging to people to the centers of power in the U.S. about a European state smashing a global South movement at a time of low morale over Vietnam. Since then, Norman Finkelstein argues, Israel took on greater importance because to be on the side of Israel, this wasn't just a Jewish thing or a Holocaust thing. This was actually a way of ingratiating yourself inside the Western power establishment because Israel was now basically a proxy of the U.S. So for the sake of your own privilege, if you supported Israel as a North American Jew, there was benefits to that. You were sort of more deeply embedded inside the U.S. power structure. And, I wasn't around in 1967 to notice that shift, but he writes about this, I think, pretty convincingly. And so that's also what I think is a factor here. It's not just, about the Holocaust, the trauma of the Holocaust. It's not just about affinity for a Jewish homeland as a Jewish person. It's also, and maybe this is subconscious, it's also, this affinity for Israel, it's also a way of saying, I'm assimilating. I'm a Westerner. I'm inside the power structure. I'm a part of something. And that might explain some of the appeal for some North American Jews when it comes to Israel.
One of the things we want to explore here on this podcast is censorship and, right now, anti-Semitism, and what we're being told is this dangerous rise of anti-Semitism is being used as a justification for very harsh censorship. There was some hearings, Pat. We do a roundup on a free speech roundup that and Pat posted an article about a hearing in the Senate Wednesday that was pretty interesting, and it was a hearing on two different bills. One of them was the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. Well, the article that Pat sent around was Vote on Anti-Semitism Awareness Act delayed after fiery Senate hearing. It seemed like this sparked more of a debate on some of these issues that we're talking about than I've ever seen in any other debates in Congress. Usually you tune them out because they were so irrelevant to our lives. And I mean, we've seen almost no debates on the weapons being shipped to Israel for the destruction of Gaza. We've seen almost no debate on hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons being sent to Ukraine. But I guess what I want to ask you is, first of all, are you seeing this dangerous rise of anti-Semitism? Because a lot of Jews seem to believe that it's true. I've certainly, members of my own family, I've had these discussions with. I haven't seen it. I've been to encampments at University of Chicago. I was a graduate of Columbia. I followed the situation there very closely. I haven't seen any evidence of a rise of anti-Semitism, but parents seem to believe that if they send their kids to some of these colleges, they're going to be harassed. They're going to be assaulted. So first question is, are you seeing that as a journalist, this rise in anti-Semitism? And then I want to ask you about some of the things from this hearing that were discussed. Go ahead.
I think I can say this with a certain amount of, again, privilege because, I'm Jewish and my father is a Nazi Holocaust survivor. So I don't feel any kind of intimidation on this issue. I feel very comfortable just speaking plainly about it, which I know for most people is not easy, but I think it's a complete scam. And I find it embarrassing, just as a Jewish person that, we're among the most privileged people in this society, but yet there's this huge fear mongering about how unsafe it is for us Jewish people. And I just think it's a complete farce to protect those people who aren't comfortable with students opposing genocide or mass murder, whatever you want to call it. There's a group of academics, Jewish academics, who just wrote an article on a blog called Academy Blog. And they're all professors, they're all scholars. Brooke Lober, Emily Meyerhoff, Emily Schneider. And it's called It's Not Too Late to Tell the Truth About Anti-Semitism on Campus. And what they point out is simply there's just no evidence for this scare at all. This is just manufactured. And if you look at how the Anti-Defamation League, for example, calculates so-called anti-Semitic incidents, they include things like students chanting Free Palestine or From the River to the Sea. Whatever you think of those slogans, they're not anti-Semitic. And it's an insult to people who've actually been victimized by anti-Semitism to constantly call out anti-Semitism whenever Israel is criticized. It completely makes completely useless the term anti-Semitism. And a similar thing happened in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn, when you had a progressive leader, Jeremy Corbyn, a genuine challenger to the establishment, a genuine humanist, which is very rare for Western politicians, especially at that level of success, because Jeremy Corbyn came very close to being prime minister. All of a sudden, we got word of a huge anti-Semitism crisis under his watch in the Labour Party, and there's been all these reports about it and investigations, and it's all very dense and boring. But the bottom line is, I think that was a scam. I think this is a scam too, and it's being used to justify censorship, as we're seeing now. And what's funny about this latest congressional hearing that you mentioned is that the reason why that bill is in trouble now is not so much because of concerns about censoring criticism of Israel, but because you had Congress members like Marjorie Taylor Greene pointing out that if this measure passes, cracking down on supposed anti-Semitism, then Christians won't be able to preach that Jews killed Jesus, which is,
which is a tradition every Easter. I have this discussion with my Christian friends. So anyway.
So Marjorie Taylor Greene all of a sudden felt threatened by this censorship, not because it was. I think it was fine for people like that when the censorship is being used to silence criticism of Israel, but not when it's being used to silence this foundational Christian teaching that Jews killed Jesus. Now all of a sudden we have to remember that we support something called free speech. And Len, I mean, you know this as a lawyer. I mean, the U.S. really is unique in its protections of free speech around the world. There's, it's very, very rare to have the protections enshrined into law that the U.S. has, protecting the right to free expression. And now all of a sudden, some people are remembering that because they're threatened with not being able to say that Jews killed Jesus. But I've never seen anything like this. Students rounded up, kidnapped because they write an op-ed. If you look at the people they've chosen to go after, these students, these are the models of what's called like civility. They're constantly talking about how we all have to find a way to coexist, that, Jewish liberation is tied to Palestinian liberation. They say all the things you would want someone to say if your main concern was so-called civility and respecting everyone and going out of your way to make everybody feel safe. But it doesn't matter, because they don't support Israel slaughtering their people, slaughtering tens of thousands of civilians, and because they're willing to oppose that publicly and calling for boycotting Israel, they're being rounded up and set off for deportation. And this comes after the Trump administration came to power by accurately pointing out the censorship that was happening under Biden. The censorship of dissenting voices on issues like COVID and the Ukraine war. There was censorship of Republicans. There was legal persecution of Trump. I think all those cases against him, for the most part, were completely farcical. But the Trump camp has now taken that playbook and I think even escalated it, because I never saw Joe Biden try to deport somebody for writing an op-ed. So it's really amazing what the Republicans are doing putting Israel first and abandoning all their professed opposition to censorship.
I think we all remember Trump coming out and saying free speech is back in America, and
Yeah.
and that it's quite sad. Just on this hearing before we move on, but I thought it was interesting. There really was some pushback according to this article. There was it seems like part of what derailed the hearing is that there was an amendment put, not just the concern about Christians at Easter being able to blame the Jews for killing Jesus, but that some senators offered an amendment that declared that you could not be declared anti-Semitic for opposing Netanyahu's led war effort, which killed more than 50,000 people, 60% women and children. So I thought that was interesting, that there was actually a direct pushback.
And that there was a combination of left and right, right? So you had the Marjorie Taylor Greens, but also you had some senators on the what would be considered the traditional left who stepped in with their own concerns about that. And it's interesting. I mean, just to point out, Israel's a democracy, and like many democracies, it's like a 51-49, actually very tightly balanced with kind of extreme parties that make an alliance and then tip you to 51%. So I would expect, Aaron, that there's a huge minority in Israel who don't agree with this current government and their policies. And so when you're talking about censoring critics of Israel, you're talking about censoring critics of Israeli policies executed by a government that was elected but can be unelected, and that people have other opinions in Israel. So I don't, anyway, but getting back to the Senate, it's interesting that, we had this coming together of left and right over free speech, because you don't see that too often. And I captioned the article when I sent it around to our board that maybe there's some hope, because it's always great to see people crossing the aisle on issues that matter like this.
The one thing I noticed, I'd love you to comment on this, is on that amendment that they single out Netanyahu, and it seems like among Jews that there's some sort of license to criticize Netanyahu, but
Yes.
not necessarily to criticize the Jewish state or the that if you're going to criticize, you should focus on the actual leader Netanyahu and not on Israel itself.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, Bernie Sanders does this. Chuck Schumer does this. Chuck Schumer, it's interesting. He's a lifelong supporter of Israel, but he's called out Netanyahu. And in fact, he gave a speech last year calling on Netanyahu to step down, which was a big deal, because this is a major champion of Israel saying that the Israeli prime minister needs to go, especially a very popular Israeli prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. So, but yes, there is this effort to personalize everything into Netanyahu, when really, even when you had, at the height of the Oslo peace process, which was overseen by, liberals, the Labor Party in Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, that's when actually settlement construction in the occupied West Bank was at its peak. So it'd be great if all this was just the problem of the fault of one man, Netanyahu. But unfortunately, Israel is foundationally committed to occupying and displacing Palestinians, no matter who is in charge. And so that's why, even if Netanyahu left, you'd still have the same problem. And it's a society that has really drifted to the right. I spent some time there in the 1990s. I lived there after high school, actually, for almost a year, living on a kibbutz. I did that program that you do at some North American Jewish summer camps. I did that, and I lived there. And that was the time of the Oslo peace process. And there was some hope back then. And there was, there was a contingent that supported a Palestinian state. But after the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000, and after all of that was blamed on Yasser Arafat and the PLO, and they were accused of walking away from this really generous Israeli peace offer, which is, I think, completely baseless and another lie to justify Israeli policies, Israel occupation. You had a real shift in Israel. And now what was called the left is a tiny sliver. There's people like Gideon Levy of Haaretz and a few very, very small groups. But the society, including its young people, uniquely, I think, because not too many societies see a further drift to the right by the younger generations. Usually they become more progressive. In Israel, it's the opposite. But you still have, though, a media that tells more truth about Israel than U.S. media does. You have outlets like Haaretz, which I have a lot of criticisms of, but simply will print facts that will not be allowed inside U.S. media pages. And so that speaks to how there is, in some ways, much freer debate about Israel inside Israel than there is inside the United States.
Could you talk a little bit about your career in journalism and sort of your what led you away from the mainstream publications to more the independent media world, independent media platforms?
Well, I've always just been aware that our media lies to us, and our media lies to us about the most cynical, inhumane things. I remember reading an article as a teenager in the New Yorker by a journalist named Mark Danner, who had talked about this massacre in El Salvador in a village called El Mozote. And, publicly, I remember just growing up in the 80s and the propaganda we'd get about Central America. And I had some vague memories of, just how that was portrayed in the media. And then the reality in this that I read in this article, this great article by Mark Danner, about how basically the forces we were supporting, arming and supporting, were massacring defenseless people. And I just intuited from a very young age that this is how it works, that powerless people have no voice and that there are targets across the world.
This was a New Yorker, you said?
Yeah. I wanted to do that kind of journalism. I thought it was very inspiring to use, again, the privilege one has as a Westerner with a platform and an outlet like the New Yorker to shine a light on a massacre of completely powerless people who have no voice, no power anywhere, are just people living their lives. And so I just wanted to, and then reading someone like Noam Chomsky, obviously you learn about all this on a mass scale, how this goes on around the world. And that's what I wanted to be a part of. I wanted to be a part of shining a light on that. And after I graduated college in the early 2000s, I got a job researching for Naomi Klein. And I also, at that time, there was a coup going on in Haiti. In 2004, the US and Canada and France helped back the overthrow for a second time that they'd done this of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was Haiti's first democratically elected president. And I knew enough about Haiti to know that he had been elected by, Haiti's poor majority, a massive social movement that was interrupted once in the early 1990s by Bush 1 backed coup. And then in 2004, Bush 2 comes along and backs the coup again. And so I went to Haiti in December 2004 to see it for myself. And I met with people, I did some interviews, and I just thought it was such a fascinating story and a powerful story. And it was what I was hearing on the ground was such a contrast to what I was reading in the media, which I just knew reflexively was all false to begin with. And so going to Haiti just kind of reinforced my own confirmation bias. And so I wrote some articles about that for the Toronto Star at the time, and working for Naomi, that helped introduce me to Democracy Now! And then I ended up working there for 10 years, where I learned so much. Just as I had learned from reading Noam Chomsky, I learned so much just about how our media works, how, the mission of Democracy Now! Is multifold. It includes giving voice to the grassroots, but it also acts as sort of a corrective. So this is the dominant mainstream narrative of the day. This is what everyone's being told. Like, yes, we have like 4 different corporate TV networks, but the opinion is exactly the same. There's no diversity of opinion between like CBS News and NBC News on the war in Iraq, which was the major issue of the time, or mass surveillance, or, the so-called war on terror. Whereas Democracy Now! Is an alternative media source. Its job is to actually show people what's going on, no matter what the establishment narrative is. So I got a huge education there. And I worked with a team of really dedicated people, and I met so many people through that show. And then I eventually went on to other places. I went to Al Jazeera for a bit, and Vice a little bit, and another independent outlet called The Real News, which is founded by a Canadian named Paul Jay. And, I tried at one point to work for establishment media. I tried to work after I left Democracy Now! To work for CBS News and MSNBC. And look, I have to be honest with you, like I pretended in the interviews to be someone I'm not. I did, because I wanted to expand my horizons, and I knew how the game was played, but they pretty much they sniffed me out, like they wouldn't let me sell out.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember. I think I first saw you with the Real News as a reporter, and I know we've talked before about Democracy Now! It's interesting that you sort of talk about that. They were sort of there to provide a counter narrative. Democracy Now! Had done a lot of stories on Syria, featuring the white helmets and really glorifying the resistance to Assad. And then you came out with your reporting, which was always factual with Aaron, about whistleblowers that had come forward. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that. But I remember I was fairly close to Amy Goodman at the time. We corresponded. I would sometimes suggest guests for her to interview, and she sometimes listened to me. But I reached out to her about your reporting, and I said, you've got to talk about these whistleblowers. I was very disappointed by that. But anyway, if you could maybe talk just a little bit about what you learned, talk about a counter narrative in Syria. And, I think we all remember that the red line with Assad, if he uses chemical weapons, that's a red line. We have to go to war. We have to fight. So anyway, if you could just maybe talk a little bit about that reporting, why it was not acknowledged by not only the mainstream media, but some of the most significant and respected alternative media.
Well, sure. And just to track this with my own journey. So after I leave Democracy Now!, not long afterwards is Russiagate, right? Where the Hillary Clinton campaign comes up with this conspiracy theory that Donald Trump is in cahoots with Russia, that Russia brainwashed millions of people into not voting for Hillary Clinton via hacked emails and social media bots. And because Trump, I think, was so scary to so many people, including my former colleagues at Democracy Now!, pretty much everybody went along with it and suspended their critical thinking, didn't ask the questions we're supposed to ask as journalists, namely, what is the evidence? and because I did that with Russiagate, I was in a very small camp of people to actually just do that, say, what is the evidence here? And at the time, it seems so stupid now because it's so dumb and it's so trivial. But you remember, this was like the major issue for a long time. And it was just as it was hard to challenge the Hamas mass rape allegations. It was hard, believe it or not, back then to challenge this allegation that Russia interfered in our election and that Donald Trump was complicit. And, this really had a lot of sway with very many people. But because I, was one of the few people who did it, because I just saw that as such a scam from the start. And I saw the dangers too. It was sort of promoting this like resurgence of Cold War chauvinism that I recognized from the 80s, like the Soviets. And I thought it was dumb. And I also thought, as someone who was very sympathetic to Bernie Sanders and was excited by his candidacy, I saw this whole effort to blame Russia as a way to distract from the real issues and a way for the Hillary Clinton wing of the party to hold on to their power rather than let the populist wing of Bernie Sanders take over, which could have actually had a meaningful chance of defeating Trump. Because if you talk to many Trump voters, rather than believing they're all duped by Russia, if you take them as human beings, a lot of people actually were favorable to Bernie Sanders, and maybe even enough would have voted for him to win. And so I just saw Russiagate as a part of a dangerous, baseless effort for the Hillary Clinton wing to hold on to their power. And so that's why I was journalistically, politically, all the reasons I was opposed to it from the start. So that set me apart, but it did help me gain an audience and a bit of a following because I was one of the few people actually applying journalistic scrutiny to this scam. Unfortunately, Democracy Now! Didn't really. And that leads me to stories like the Syria chemical weapons issue, which, plays into this binary that became created, because Russia was blamed for Trump baselessly, but because a lot of people bought it, this binary became accepted where you have like Russian disinformation and truth. And if someone declares something to be Russian disinformation, that it's bad, it must be bad. And that was the same case with Syria, where because Russia intervened in Syria to help defend the government there from the regime change campaign that the U.S. was heavily involved in, everything that criticized the U.S. role in Syria was Russian disinformation. And that included challenging allegations of chemical weapons attacks, which were lodged against the Syrian government and were very prevalent. And as you said, were used to justify warfare. Now, this originates with Obama, who made an offhand comment that about how, if I start to see chemical weapons being moved around and deployed by all actors on the ground, he said, that's important to remember. He said by all actors on the ground. He didn't just say by the Syrian government. He said by all actors on the ground. Then that would change my calculus and I might be inclined to intervene militarily. Now, him saying that created incentive for someone who wants U.S. military intervention to launch a chemical attack. And who is that? Well, it's obvious. It's the insurgents fighting to overthrow the Syrian government, because although the insurgents were heavily armed by countries, including the U.S., they didn't have a air force. Assad did, with the help of Russia, which came in 2015. So Obama laying down this red line created an incentive for for someone to launch a chemical attack and blame it on Assad. There's an article in Harper's Magazine a few years ago by Charles Glass, veteran correspondent, former correspondent for ABC News, has written recently a book about Syria that's very good, that I wrote the foreword for. And he wrote an article in Harper's Magazine where he interviewed a former U.S. diplomat, an ambassador to a Middle Eastern country, who said that the red line was an open invitation to a false flag. And that's exactly right. Like, if Obama is saying this is the one condition under which I will intervene against Assad, then somebody who needs that intervention to win a war is going to help create that condition. It's an obvious incentive. But note also in his comment, he said, if I see chemical weapons being used by any actor on the ground, and that was a reference to the fact, and we know this now from leaks, that he received intelligence that the insurgents had their own chemical weapons program as well. So that's what he was referring to. But his line was taken as a threat against Assad. And this leads to the first major case of chemical weapons use. There was actually an earlier one against Syrian soldiers that got widely ignored. And in fact, that use against Syrian soldiers led Assad to ask UN inspectors to come to Syria in August 2013. And right after they get there, there's a major chemical attack in Ghouta, where hundreds of people are killed with sarin gas. And immediately the insurgents blame that on Assad, which would have meant that Assad, after Obama says, I'll only attack Assad if he uses chemical weapons, and after Assad had just invited chemical weapons inspectors into the country to investigate a chemical attack that he says was committed against his forces, that he decided, I'm going to go ahead and use chemical weapons now. It made absolutely no sense. But at the time, just as it always is with these pro-war narratives, that was used to build the case for war. And Obama was under huge pressure to bomb Syria over that. But then he pulled back. And the reason that he pulled back was he said that he didn't have congressional approval, which is true, because Congress denied to actually hold a vote on that. And he also said the reason I pulled back is because Russia has brokered this deal for Syria to destroy its chemical weapons stockpile, which Syria did. But that's not the only reason why. And we know now from the reporting of Seymour Hersh and also from Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic magazine that James Clapper, who was Obama's top intelligence chief, went to Obama and said to him, the intelligence of Assad's guilt is not a slam dunk. And Clapper chose those words very deliberately. What is slam dunk? That was the term that George Tenet, who was the head of George W. Bush's CIA, that was the term he used to tell Bush that the case against Saddam is a slam dunk. So James Clapper was basically telling Obama, this is another Iraq WMD moment where you're being duped essentially into going to war on false pretenses. So that's why Obama pulled back. But given that he had this red line, and given that, again, going back to atrocity propaganda, chemical weapons is such a horrific thing, and the image and the suffering it causes is horrific. And we saw the images from Ghouta of people foaming at the mouth. It's horrible. It creates a certain emotional reaction in people. And understandably, many people think, yeah, we have to go to war with these people. How can we possibly let these people stay in power? Same thing with Hamas and Gaza. They committed mass rape. They burned all these babies alive. They beheaded babies. We can't negotiate with them. That's the point of these allegations, is to basically foreclose diplomacy, foreclose peaceful solutions, make sort of war inevitable is the only rational solution to these horrific crimes. And we've seen that playbook repeated in Syria a few times. When Trump comes in, Trump was talking about ending the regime change war, that he was done with it. He didn't want to overthrow Assad anymore. He knew that the insurgency was dominated by al-Qaeda. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. And just as he was actually winding down the Syria war, once again, we got more allegations of chemical attacks. And the one that I came in on was Duma in April 2018, where there were dozens of people killed. There's horrific images, and Syria was accused of using chemical weapons there. But the story that I have reported on was that the OPCW, the World's Top Chemical Weapons Watchdog, went to Syria, did an investigation. Their original report said there was no evidence of a chemical attack. If you read their wording carefully, they're suggesting that this might have been staged by insurgents on the ground. But we know now from leaks that those initial findings were censored, doctored, kept from the public, and the OPCW put out a report based on unfounded claims and based on evidence that was never there. And 2 whistleblowers, at least, protested this from the inside. They were silenced and marginalized. That's what I've reported on. And if you look at establishment media, this narrative is so foundational to the war effort in Syria, to the dirty war there, to justify arming an al-Qaeda dominated insurgency, that the whistleblowers basically don't exist. So the only time they've been mentioned in corporate media was that I can remember is once in the New York Times, when at the bottom of an article about another issue, about like this group called Bellingcat, which is a NATO government funded organization. In the bottom of the article, they say in passing, they talk about an email from one OPCW investigator. That's it, who raised some questions in a very ambiguous way about the investigation. So this one sentence ambiguously worded in passing, it's the only time that I've seen in corporate media where the OPCW whistleblowers have even been acknowledged, let alone having their findings and the leaks explored. And unfortunately, Democracy Now! Went along with that. It's, and on that one, I'll just say we live in a really sophisticated propaganda system where no one's told what to say. But I just think that the way certain narratives are promoted really skillfully, really cynically, it either intimidates people into silence where they just don't want to go certain places. They don't want to be accused of spreading Russian propaganda or questioning atrocity denial or whatever it is. And also there are subconscious incentives too. And I know this from my own experience trying to like make it in journalism, that you just subconsciously intuit that if you don't raise certain questions here, if you go along with a certain thing, if you parrot the certain narrative, you're going to have better career prospects, and you're going to be more. And even if you don't care about career prospects, you'll be accepted. You'll be invited into fancy spaces. You'll be invited on corporate TV. You'll be in, as opposed to being on the outside, on the margins, which is where I've chosen, or which is where at least I've ended up through the choices I've made, even though at times I've tried to get in on the inside.
I mean, it's interesting because I imagine that people don't go to or make the decision to become a journalist so that they could become a mouthpiece for power or a tool for power. But what you're saying is that there's all of these internal pressures, to be invited to the cocktail parties or just to advance your career, that, if you think a certain way or if you report a certain way, that you're not going to get the prestigious jobs at the New York Times or MSNBC or even Fox News. So how do you avoid those pressures? I mean, I know you and Max lives in DC. It certainly seems like that's a dangerous place for journalists. If you want to be, don't want to be shunned, you want to be invited to parties and things like that. Somehow the two of you seem immune from these pressures. Is there something advice that you have for other journalists to resist?
Well, look, it's hard to give advice because everyone's in a different situation. I've never had I don't have yet a family to support. I don't have kids yet. And I've also had a certain amount of privilege. Like I've always known that if journalism failed for me, which is, a prospect that I've faced many times, that things were just not going to work out, that I'm not going to at least be out on the street. Like I have a family who can back me up and help me get back on my feet if I need it. Right. So I've always had that in the background. Some people don't have that. Journalism is a industry that is dominated by really privileged people, very, very privileged people. And they also want to hold on to that privilege. They don't want to be outcast anymore. There's an incentive structure in that as well. Now, I'm wired ultimately to just not care, and I believe I just want to put truth first. That's the value I have. But I understand not everybody is in the material position where they can make that sort of a red line. People have all different sorts of pressures on them. Families to support, maybe a loved one who needs healthcare, and you get healthcare through a certain job working for a major corporation. A million factors can get one to sort of make compromises.
For you, you've had your integrity, you've kept your integrity, you've kept your authenticity, and you just maybe were lucky, maybe not lucky that in the time that you've been working, there's been a real thirst for truth, authenticity among a growing segment of the population. Whereas before you might have been a complete outcast, now I think you're finding some success and some, demand for your views, for your work, because it's so untrue in the corporate media, and people sense the falsity of it all. They know that you're gonna give them your honest take, and there's some value in that. I think that we're all lucky to have you, but we're lucky to have this ecosystem too that's developed even in the last 4 years, where you're not such an outsider anymore.
No,
you're just different.
I got really lucky that Russiagate happened at a time when I was trying to find my own voice. I just left Democracy Now! And Democracy Now! Was a great place to work, but it was also I felt stuck there. I wanted to develop my own journalistic voice, and I knew I couldn't do it there. So I had to move on. And right after I moved on, Russiagate came along, where everybody bought into what I think was one of the dumbest conspiracy theories of all time. Everybody, meaning my media colleagues. And I didn't. And so I was lucky in that respect that helped set me apart. And that gave me a certain voice that I didn't have before. And that's how a lot of people.
And those media colleagues, the ones who are repeating the silly, conspiracy theories, can you name? I mean, maybe you can because you're in the business. I can't name one of them. If I asked for a mainstream journalism of your age cohort, they're completely forgettable, completely interchangeable. Maybe they went for the career, but I don't think they have any currency. They don't have any value. They're completely replaceable by another person who's going to read the script. And I think they made a wrong choice, and you made a right choice. But it must have been a brave choice to make.
Listen, at the time, it was a choice. I remember thinking, if I come out against this now, this is a path I'm taking. There's no going back from this. It seems so silly now. It seems like, and I don't want to sort of over dramatize, because really it's just a very trivial story in the long run. But at the time, this was the biggest thing, and challenging this was so difficult. And I was up for a job at MSNBC at the time. Not that I would have gotten it anyway, but I remember thinking, like, if I come out against this, that's it. Like, I'm not going back, and I might have to leave journalism as a result. I definitely had to think about that, because this was such a powerful narrative at the time. And because it was among liberals, this was the reason why Trump won, and this, Russia was being blamed for everything. I just knew that if I went against this, some people would never welcome me back into their fold. And so that was a choice I made. But I remember thinking, this story is so dumb, so baseless, and actually so dangerous, that if I'm not going to challenge this, then why be in journalism? If I'm going to censor myself over something so transparently dumb, if I can't challenge this, then what's the point of calling myself a journalist? And so that is the choice that I made there. And I was lucky that it paid off. I was rewarded for my independence there. I was.
You talk about how dangerous it is, and really how important it was to debunk some of the tenets of Russiagate, because, as you write in your recent Substack piece, Russiagate has really been used to criminalize diplomacy. I mean,
yes,
frightening that we have been sort of stumbling and bumbling towards nuclear war with Russia, with absolutely, it appears, no top-level talks between the United States, the Biden administration, Blinken, Sullivan, and Putin's government in Russia. It's really frightening. I mean, I think was maybe one of the appeals of Trump, is that at least, well, he does seem to know how to talk to people. He's not afraid of that. But even for Trump, as you point out, he's really crippled by some of these Russiagate stories and narratives. So I just want to really credit you for going after that narrative, because it is so dangerous, and the consequences for the human race. You were on with Jimmy Dore's producer, and he made a comment, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, but I think it was in reaction to the New York Times revelations from that big piece that they put out about, the truth is the United States really was closely guiding the war in Ukraine. But what he said is, it seems like the Biden administration's policy was just, let's see how much money we can shovel to our big donors in the war industry without blowing up the world. And, that seemed to sort of encapsulate it for me. So anyway, we really need reporters to debunk some of these myths. My only complaint with your reporting on Russiagate was sometimes it seemed like you were a little too cautious. And I know that's kind of your style. You have to have the facts. You don't really go out on a limb or whatever the saying is. But, there was a lot of reporting. I'm just talking about the leaks. And this was sort of a huge thing that Russia hacked the emails of the Democratic Party and whatever. This is why liberals hate Julian Assange, because somehow they blame him for all of this. But there were people out there, and I'm talking about like Bill Binney, that said, no, this is not true. We've done some investigation or some technical investigation. And in fact, this was not a hack. This was a leak by somebody, an insider. I don't know if it was somebody at the DNC. And then, of course, there's speculation about Seth Rich and whether he was the person that provided this information. He was murdered on the streets of DC. I notice you never really go there in your reporting, but I'm just wondering whether you think sometimes you're too cautious or too...
Right. Well, just to explain my caution, so I started writing about Russiagate for The Nation magazine, where you had a huge contingent of staffers, veteran staffers, who were just all in on Russiagate and couldn't tolerate any dissent, to the point where they would like openly insult the husband of the publisher of The Nation, Stephen F. Cohen, who was married to Katrina Vanden Heuvel, who's the editor and publisher of The Nation. And they would like call him out and pretty much call for him being censored, which I just, like the hubris of like calling for anyone's censorship, especially someone who's like married to your boss. But that's how like fanatic people were about Russiagate at the time. And to the point where there was this incident at The Nation where a veteran journalist named Patrick Lawrence, they used to write for the International Herald Tribune, wrote an article about Bill Binney, as you mentioned, doing these forensic studies of the DNC hack or leak, whatever you want to call it. And he pointed out that this was not a hack. This was a leak. And that caused this massive outrage at The Nation. And Katrina Vanden Heuvel was basically pressured into retracting, which she declined to do, to her credit. But she, to sort of appease her critics, she hired an outside neutral arbiter who did this whole long investigation. And basically the conclusion that they came up with was, yes, in covering major stories of consequence, it's important to be diligent with the facts. So basically this big investigation led to nothing, because actually the story was accurate, that there was no evidence that this was a hack, and that this very well could have been a leak. Now, as for why I don't go into Seth Rich, it's because I just don't know. I'm convinced, certainly, that this was not a hack. I'm convinced of that, not even so much by the Bill Binney stuff, which technically I don't understand. But the fact is that the Hillary Clinton campaign lodged this allegation about Russian hacking, just as it was also framing Trump as a Russian agent. So what are the odds that Hillary Clinton and her campaign are somehow going to accurately discover that Russia hacked their server while they happen to be framing Trump as a Russian agent? It just seemed a little bit too convenient. And then you had, of course, all this other evidence, including CrowdStrike, which is hired by Clinton campaign, admitting under oath that they had no evidence of Russian hacking, and all these other disclosures that I've covered over the years that have built up. And now you have a strong pile of evidence that this was not a hack, and no evidence that this was, except for Robert Mueller saying that it was, which, a lot of media colleagues just wrote down as fact, but I don't do that. Just because someone says something doesn't make it true, especially if they have a track record of lying, as Robert Mueller does. So, but as for Seth Rich, like, what is there to go on? There's Julian Assange making a very suggestive comment saying, he talked about Seth Rich in the summer of 2016 after Seth Rich was killed. And he said that, we take source protection very seriously. And he talked about Seth Rich. He talked about Seth Rich was recently killed. But then he was asked, are you saying that Seth Rich was your source? And Julian Assange said, I'm not saying that. And then he put out a statement making very clear he was not trying to say that Seth Rich was his source, even though WikiLeaks also did offer a reward for information leading to Seth Rich's murder. So, but from that, I'm lead to two options. Either Julian Assange is suggesting accurately that Seth Rich is his source, or he's just being a troll. And I've never met Julian Assange, but people who know him back then told me that they believe that might be what he could be doing. So I just never knew which strand to go on there, and I just didn't see enough. Now, since then, there's been a case playing out in court for years now, led by a lawyer named Ty Clevenger. And what he's shown is that the FBI has really dragged its feet in releasing what it knows about Seth Rich, in releasing what it has collected in the Seth Rich investigation, the contents of Seth Rich's laptop. And there's been a lot of obfuscation there. So what you have is a suggestive comment from Julian Assange and some questionable feet dragging by the FBI. But to me, that's still not enough for me to go on. So that's why I haven't touched it. Maybe we'll get more that'll change my mind. But what I am confident saying, and I've done a lot of work on this, is the evidence that Russia hacked the DNC is just not there.
So, Aaron, we thank you for coming on today. We appreciate everything you've done, as you can hopefully tell. And we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And we hope you'll come back and talk more. You've always got something interesting that you're working on. And we would love to hear from you again.
I'll come back anytime. And it's great to talk to you guys.
See you again soon, I hope.
Thanks very much again for having me. It's great to talk to you.
We appreciate it.